The term herd immunity is often heard in the news in regard to vaccinations. At an individual level, vaccines prevent people from getting a specific disease, be it measles or polio. But at the population level, it is not always necessary for everyone in the population to have immunity to a disease to prevent a widespread epidemic in the population. This is because there's a certain threshold of immunity in a population that prevents a disease from becoming widespread. Let's take a closer look at how this happens. In any given population, there are three groups of people with regard to any specific disease-causing organism. There are those who are currently infected with the organism, those who are capable of contracting the disease, and those who are immune to it. In cases of communicable diseases, an epidemic begins when one person is infected and becomes contagious or is capable of spreading the disease to others. For example, each year we experience an epidemic of chickenpox and influenza in the general population. The infected individual comes into contact with an individual who does not have the disease, but is not immune to it either. An exposure event can be breathing the air in a room where someone is sneezing or coughing, or can be direct contact with the infected person. Either way, an exposure occurs and the susceptible person now has the organism in their system. At this stage, the exposed individual may fight off the disease and become immune without showing symptoms. Exposure does not automatically mean infection with symptoms. However, most infectious diseases are categorized as diseases because they're quite good at making us sick and causing illness. We'll assume this is the case here with the chickenpox exposure. At this stage, the second person becomes sick and infectious. This person can go on to expose another healthy but susceptible person to the infectious organism. That person then becomes sick and infectious. Then another susceptible individual becomes exposed and then becomes sick themselves, and the process continues on and on. In this way, the spread of the disease-causing organism quickly moves through the population, creating a chain of infection that continues unabated. So if the point of medical intervention is to prevent such chains of infection, how is this accomplished? Let's start again with an initial sick individual. This person is able to pass the disease-causing organism on to a new susceptible person. The second individual is now sick and capable of passing the disease on to another. However, in this case, the next individual in the chain is already immune to this particular infectious organism. In this example, the person has either already had chickenpox, gotten better and is now immune, or they were vaccinated and have become immune. At this point, the chain of infection is broken, and no more people are exposed or become sick. In other words, no epidemic occurs. Now let's consider a more realistic scenario and see how diseases are transmitted through a population. Here we have one sick individual who comes into contact with 4 other people who are not immune to this infectious organism. After all, this is a more likely scenario. Someone who's sick could come into contact with many people. We'll only consider 4 here, though in reality it could be dozens of people, say in a classroom. One sick child can expose 20 other students in elementary school, or perhaps a couple hundred in a college lecture hall. Of the 4 people exposed, each of them becomes infected, shows symptoms, and can now expose another 4 people to the disease. This next group of people becomes sick and goes on to infect another 4 individuals, who then go on to infect another 4 people. In the end, since everyone in the population is susceptible, everyone comes down with the disease. This may not be a problem for chickenpox, where the incidence of death is extremely low. But say this is the pattern for Ebola, where more than 80 to 90% will die without extensive medical intervention. High mortality rates present a serious problem when everyone exposed can become sick. So what happens when we start to account for a small number of people in the population who happen to already be immune to the infectious organism? In this case, there are only a few immune individuals in the population. Will this be enough to protect the population as a whole? The initial patient exposes 4 people to the disease. However, one of these 4 is immune. That means that all the people down the line who otherwise would have been exposed to the infectious organism now will not be exposed. However, there are 3 infected individuals who can now spread the disease onward. Of the 3 sick individuals, only 2 are able to pass on the infectious organism because one of the next 3 in the chain happens to be immune. The disease is blocked from spreading. Now there are only 2 sick individuals to pass the disease on to the next individuals in the chain. However, of the 2 sick individuals, only one happens to pass along the disease because the other has exposed an immune individual who cannot become infectious and spread the disease further. Now there's only one person left who's infectious and who manages to spread the disease to one last person. Now the outbreak's run its course, but look at the results. 6 individuals were prevented from even coming into contact with the illness thanks to the few who were immune. They broke the chain of infection. However, 7 individuals did come down with the illness. More than were protected. This would be considered an epidemic outbreak. If this illness were a fatal one, almost half of the population would have died. Let's see what happens in a case where we have a mere 50% immunity in the population, a level considered far below effective levels of herd immunity. We begin with our first infected individual who exposes 4 other people. In this case, half of the individuals exposed to the infectious agent are already immune. However, the other half do become sick and infectious. Of these 2, only one is able to pass the infection on to a susceptible individual, as the other exposed individual is immune. At this stage, the remaining infected patient has a 50-50 chance of exposing the infectious agent to a susceptible individual. In this example, the next person happens to be immune, so the chain of infection is broken and the epidemic is thwarted. Even at 50% herd immunity, only 3 members of the population become sick. There are many more individuals who are capable of becoming infected, but since they are surrounded by others who are immune, they never become exposed, thus they never become ill. Still, having about 20% of your population dying off would be considered unacceptable. Ideally, it's most effective to have herd immunity in the 85 to 95% range. When this level of immunity is achieved, the odds are pretty low of an infected individual being able to expose a susceptible person to the disease. Even if this does happen, the odds are again low of that second person being able to find and infect a third one. Even in situations where a few cases appear, the disease cannot spread to the population as a whole and cause a massive outbreak when herd immunity is sufficiently high.